It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome, Quiller Nation, to another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. My guest for this episode is a historian and writer. He has written several books, including also he has written a full-length play, which we're going to talk a little bit about today during the episode. His name is David Kruh. You can easily find him at davidkruh.com, and that is spelled Kruh. davidkruh.com is where you can find him. And after you hear this episode, I'm certain you're going to want to reach out to David. David, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I have to say I've looked at the list of former podcast guests, and I'm flattered to be included amongst all those very accomplished people. So I'm really glad to be with you today.
Well, thank you for noticing. I pride myself on being able to bring a wide variety of guests to the program from a wide variety of backgrounds and fields of study. And yeah, it's sort of a source of pride for me. And I think that everything from the highly learned to the most obscure in this topic, this great literary mystery that we've been trying to solve for so long. But you are a very different and unique guest because through you, I discovered something that I think many of my guests have never heard of either, which is why this is such an exciting episode. I discovered that there was actually a trial in Chicago, Illinois, back in 1916, and William Shakespeare was put on trial, and he lost. He was found not guilty of writing the canon that is attributed to him, and instead the court found in the favor of Francis Bacon. I want to let you tell us a little bit about how you came to this knowledge and why it has become such a part of what you have presented through your life and your writings. It was an article that I found of yours in History Magazine that first alerted me to the trial, and then I found there are newspaper accounts and literal record of this, and I was shocked that through all of my Shakespearean authorship study travels, I had never come across this before. And even a close friend of mine who's also a friend of the program, who is a lawyer, was surprised to hear of it. And of course, now he's doing his own deep dive into it, as I'm sure many of the other lawyers and law professors who follow the program are going to go do their search. But tell me, David, how did you come upon this exceptional trial, this exceptional moment where a court of law found that Francis Bacon was the true author of Shakespeare?
Well, it actually begins with my father, Louis Kruh, who from boyhood had been fascinated by codes and ciphers. In fact, I'm holding in my hand the little leather book of Edgar Allan Poe's The Gold Bug, which, as Poe aficionados know, is all about a secret code that gets deciphered. And so my father spent his life studying codes and ciphers. And he actually, along with renowned author David Kruh, who wrote the legendary Codebreakers book, and another friend who was also into codes and ciphers, whose name, by the way, ironically, was Cy, or Cipher was his first name, literally. I mean, you just can't make that stuff up. They formed a magazine called Cryptologia, diving into the minutiae of codes and ciphers and all these little historical rabbit holes they went down. And my father discovered this story. I wish he were around today, because he might have told me, but at this point, I don't remember how he found it. But find it he did. And my father he went down that rabbit hole, deep into it. And the story that he uncovered is this. So your listeners are, of course, familiar with the people who proposed that Francis Bacon was a potential author of the canon, if not the entire canon. I know there are some people who believe that there were different authors who authored different parts of the canon. Mm-hmm. Francis Bacon, of course, inspired the creation of the Bacon Society. They had a publication called Baconia, I think is the right way I'm pronouncing it. And one of the people who were deeply embedded in this story was a woman named Elizabeth Wells Gallup. Fascinating woman. She was a Bostonian who was educated at the Sorbonne. She taught English for about 20 years, was a high school principal. And she knew what other scholars were familiar with, that among Francis Bacon's accomplishments was the invention of a cipher. And a cipher is a code that hides the real message. And in order to decipher it, you have to know what the key is. How do you decipher this code? Well, what Francis Bacon created was something that he called the biliteral cipher. I have an engineering degree, so my fellow engineers know that the binary code of zeros and ones, when combined together in groups of 8, can form the letters of the alphabet and all the punctuation, and that's called the ASCII code. Well, Francis Bacon only needed 5 of those positions, but he didn't use zeros and ones. He used the letter A and the letter B. And by making whatever letter you wanted to be an A in italics, and the letters you wanted to be the B as a standard font, non-italicized, mm-hmm. and if you grouped the italic and the non-italic in groups of 5, you could hide a message within any text. Well, Mrs. Gallup was one of the proponents of the theory that within the first folio, Francis Bacon had hidden using his biliteral cipher, the message that would clearly state that Francis Bacon was the author of Shakespeare. Now, looking back historically, there are a lot of examples of authors who have done similar things. There's a great story of a book in Greek, which is titled Strife of Love in a Dream. And some people regard it as one of the most beautiful books ever published. The strange thing was there was no author listed. But in 1512, someone noticed that the first letter of each chapter spelled out a message that read, "Brother Francesco Colonna passionately loves Polia." He was a Dominican monk who was still alive when the book was published, hence the need for that secrecy. So not only did we have Francis Bacon who created this biliteral cipher, but we had examples, and there were others, of pieces of literature that had these actual hidden codes in them. Now, the work that Elizabeth Gallup was doing caught the attention of another character in history. His name was George Fabian.
Yeah. He talk about a character. No kidding, right? And then we'll get into his counterpart, Colonel Selig, as well.
We'll get to that.
Yeah,
we'll get to that.
What you're talking about, a big character. I had no idea he even existed. And when you rabbit hole into that cat, Wow. I mean, just wow. What a, like, wow. Eccentric billionaire beyond all compare.
And the story of George Fabian begins here in Boston. He was the son of the man who founded the Bliss Fabian Cotton Goods Company. And George, as the son, as was the tradition back in the 1800s, was destined to become the president and owner of the Bliss Fabian Company when his father died. And that's the last thing George wanted. He wanted to set his own path, to create his own legacy. So he quits his father's company and he disappears and he goes off and he becomes a lumberjack and he works in all these jobs. And then he gets a job in St. Louis selling cotton goods for the Bliss Fabian Corporation. Back in Boston.
Under a fake name, right? Like he changes his name, right? So that they don't know who he is?
Yes, he changes his name.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a nice little piece of information I should have led with.
It's kind of important that they don't know who he really, truly is.
Exactly,
he goes to work as like a frontline salesman for his father's company.
Thank you. Yes. So back in Boston, the old man starts getting these sales reports and he sees his number one salesperson in St. Louis and he says, "Bring me that man. I want to see this go-getter." And into the office walks his son, George. So they mended fences, all was forgiven. And when
this
the
needs
old
to be
man
its own movie, you know, like that whole story is incredible. And it needs to be, it really needs to be its own film because just that moment gives me chills. The reunion moment between father and son and the conflicting emotions that had to be going on right there in that moment. Like two actors would love to dive into that moment.
Yeah. So where is Ted Sarandis from Netflix? We got a great series going on here. This could be the end of episode 1. So
let's just call it Bliss.
That would be a great title. Thank you. Okay. So George's father passes. George inherits the company, and he continues to run it, and then he sells it. And with the money, he opens a place in Geneva, Illinois, that he called Riverbank Labs. George was a very inquisitive, intellectually interested person. And he began hiring people, bringing in people to Riverbank Labs. And it was a beautiful campus, by the way. It's still there today. There is a museum because there was a lot of legitimate, if I may, with air quotes, research going on, advances in acoustics and genetics and other fields were made at Riverbank Labs. On the other side, there were also people who were trying to develop the perpetual motion machine. And there was this woman, Elizabeth Wells Gallup, whose theories about Francis Bacon having written the Shakespeare canon had captured George Fabian's imagination. And he brings Elizabeth, who brings along another woman, Kate Preston, and the two of them begin to assemble a group of researchers, including a young woman who had recently graduated with a degree in library science named Elizabeth Smith, a 13th generation Quaker woman who began working on that first folio, or a copy of the first folio. One of the other people that Fabian brought in was a first-generation Russian Jewish immigrant by the name of William Friedman. He had a degree from Cornell in genetics, and Fabian was interested in having a breed of wheat being developed that would grow in the desert. So you got Elizabeth Smith, by the way, an adorable young woman, and here's William Friedman, and Friedman can't help but notice this woman working with this Elizabeth Wells Gallup. Now the story starts as we go further down that rabbit hole. Friedman had a hobby. It was photography. And Elizabeth Gallup asked William Friedman, would he, in his spare time, help her by taking close-up photographs of her copy of the first folio. That way, she could really determine which of those letters were italicized and which ones were standard font. William, seeing Elizabeth, and maybe I'm extrapolating a bit, but I'm guessing that may have been part of his reason for wanting to help Ms. Gallup. So he somehow ends up working full-time on the Shakespeare-Bacon project. Now it's 1916, and Ms. Gallup, with the photographs and with the work that Ms. Smith is doing, has written a book, a small book, The Shakespearean Ciphers Examined, and it is going to explode this myth that William Shakespeare was the author. And it's going to prove that Francis Bacon actually wrote the canon. At the same time, a movie producer by the name of William Selig, S-E-L-I-G, is about to release 4 movies. Now, this is 1916, so these were silent films of 4 of Shakespeare's plays.
Which cracks me up because when it's a silent film and there's no text, then why does it matter who wrote the plays at that point? You're not hearing any of the beautiful language. You're not, Okay. I mean, I suppose they would put up little like intermittent screens with some of the quotes from the characters, perhaps, in some of these silent films. But that always that kind of like I found that ironic that Selig got so obsessed with this idea that it was going to ruin him if the truth came out, so to speak. And
if I may bastardize a Shakespeare quote, therein lies the tale. Because Selig sues Riverbank, claiming in court that if this book were published, it would cause undue harm to his business, that of those movies based on Shakespeare's plays. And a court date is assigned in Chicago with a fellow named Judge Tuthill, Judge William Tuthill, who was an interesting, again, I'm going to use that word again, another character, actually a fascinating fellow who was one of the pioneers in the juvenile establishment of a court system that was designed for juveniles. So the trial opened in early April of 1916. And here's what frustrated my father, who desperately wanted to see a transcript of the trial. After all, that's, it was done longhand back then, but there should have been a transcript.
Yeah.
But despite my father's best efforts, he could not find the transcript, and I'll explain why I think he was not successful shortly. So they have the trial. Those who are familiar with the arguments for Francis Bacon being the author, those who understand the biliteral cipher, those who believe that the photographs that William Friedman had taken absolutely showed the italics versus the non-italics, and I'll call them the deciphering that Ms. Gallup claimed to see, which basically said Francis Bacon writ these works. And when the trial, it was a 10-day trial. When it concluded,
immense. That's an incredible amount of time to hear evidence on this topic back and forth in a court of law. I mean, 10 days, like murder trials sometimes don't last 10 days. That's an incredible amount of time.
So when the trial was over, Judge Tuthill, there was no jury. The judgment was passed down by Judge Tuthill that Francis Bacon was determined to be the author of the works previously attributed to Shakespeare. Now, the next thing that happens is it's a worldwide story. In fact, most of the stories about the results of the trial were either tongue-in-cheek or just out-and-out amusement. One reporter wrote that it looks like Shakespeare Avenue will have to be changed to the name Bacon Street. And one of the workers at the Selig, William Selig's film company was contacted about the trial. And what the reporter claimed was that this person just laughed and said, "Oh, yes, there'll be about 1 million lines of publicity, won't there?" Because the films of William Selig, those 4 Shakespeare films, were great successes. And Elizabeth Wells Gallup's book did very well, sold a lot of copies. And now we're going to drop the other shoe. And as a former marketer, I spent decades as a marketer and in public relations, because the truth is that this whole thing, and by the way, I cast no aspersions on Ms. Gallup. From my reading, I believe that she honestly, truly believed that Francis Bacon really wrote those works.
And beyond that, I mean, she truly believed that Francis Bacon was an illegitimate son of Elizabeth I. And that's, by the way, but that theory continues to float around. In fact, I've had a guest who believes that Elizabeth may have had 4 or 5 children, and that Bacon is just one of them. I think that stretching it, I don't know how she could have hidden that many pregnancies, but I think that when you get that sort of hyperbolic version of the tale, it tends to lead back to some element of truth. Where there's smoke, there's fire. So. I think it's certainly plausible that she had at least 1 or maybe even 2 illegitimate children, and Francis Bacon may or may not have been one of them.
Right, and so I believe in Elizabeth Wells Gallup's sincerity on this topic.
Okay,
but then we find out when the whole thing was. And here's what. Oh yes, the next thing actually that happens is, a week or so after the trial and after the decision by Judge Tuthill, there was so much embarrassment in Chicago, especially among the judiciary, for this decision having been rendered, that a bunch of judges got together and they vacated the ruling, which infuriated George Fabian, of course.
I would hope that it would have infuriated Judge George Tuthill as well.
Well, it didn't, and here's why. Because Judge Tuthill and William Selig and George Fabian were, what the kids say today, besties. They were good friends. In fact, even though only 2 of them actually had a rank of colonel, they called themselves the Colonel Club. And they conspired between the 3 of them to have this trial. Selig would get publicity for his movies. Fabian would get publicity for Riverbank. I'm not really sure what publicity or what Tuthill got out of it, except maybe just being a part of this episode. But what happens next is right out of a spy novel. And given what both William and Elizabeth did after the trial, that is a completely appropriate analogy. Because here's what happens. The publicity of the trial comes to the attention of some people in the U.S. Signal Corps. who were very interested in the idea of ciphers and codes. Remember, it's 1916, it's 1917. America enters the war in April of 1917, and there's a great need to be sending and receiving secret messages.
It's like literally 1 year after the trial, right? Because the trial occurred in April of 1916, and then a year later it's World War I, and we're worried about the Krauts, as it were.
Yes, and so were this a video chat, you would see me nodding my head vigorously because yes, the timing was perfect. William Friedman, aside from being a good photographer, was an amazing mathematician. And his involvement in this, quote, deciphering of the Bacon cipher within the first folio inspired him to do more work on codes and ciphers. And that's what George Fabian was telling the U.S. Army Signal Corps, that we can help the war effort because we have people who can help you develop these codes and ciphers. And for anyone who is familiar with something called the Zimmerman telegram, this was Riverbank's real first taste of glory in terms of codes and ciphers. So we know that America was not involved yet in the war in early 1917. A telegram from Germany to the Mexican, to a representative of the Mexican government, was written in code. It was William Friedman who decoded the telegram, and basically what the telegram said was, Germany, if Mexico got involved in the war, if Mexico would basically attack our southern border, attack Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Germany would basically let Mexico have whatever territory they could manage to gobble up and divert America's attention from getting involved in the European war. Well, the telegram was decoded, and the Zimmerman telegram was actually one of the impetuses for the United States to declare war on Germany. That, again, April of 1917. So now George Fabian, William Friedman, they're involved with the U.S. Signal Corps. And through the U.S. involvement in World War I, William Friedman would actually save thousands of Allied lives by decoding German messages about where they were going to attack on various lines along the front. When the war is over, William Friedman continues working with the Signal Corps on matters of national security, as we would call it today. Meanwhile, and again, it boggles the mind to think how lucky they were that William Friedman would meet up with Elizabeth Smith.
Well, when you think about it has so many elements that I'm shocked that it hasn't actually become like a full-length film, or, as you say, a Netflix series. Because when you think about, here's this young geneticist, he's sort of snatched out of school while he's working on his doctorate, right? By this, eccentric billionaire. They didn't call him billionaires back then, but the wealth he had would have been equal to billions today.
Yeah, sure. I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and he's supposed to be working on, and one of the reasons I think that Fabian grabs him is because of his Jewish descent, because he's supposed to be working on creating some sort of a grain that can grow in the desert, because of rumors that the Brits, who control the region at the time, are going to give a portion of the desert to the Jewish people. Go figure. Like that, how timely is that with today right now too, right?
Well, that was the Balfour Declaration, and that's what they promised, and they reneged on it.
Yeah.
So, but anyway.
Then Friedman sees Smith And apparently, from from all I can tell, I mean, you want to talk about like the classic love at first sight, boy meets girl story. Goes to hell with genetics.
Yeah.
I'm going to use my camera to woo this woman because she's passionate about this other thing that I really don't care that much about. But I'm going to dive into it. And he gets the girl. They marry within a year of the trial. They're married, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So he gets the girl in the end, and then the two of them go on to become perhaps the most famous code-breaking couple in the history of the world.
There you go. And Elizabeth was no slouch in the cryptology department either. In fact, she was so adept at, and how much it was from being with William, how much he had to teach her, or how much she was a bright woman. She was steeped in this whole biliteral code thing. But she ended up working for the Treasury Department. 1920s, Prohibition. There are rum runners off the coast of Florida, and they're sending secret messages on the wireless, as it was called then, on radio, from these ships anchored off the Florida coast. It was Elizabeth who decoded those messages and would end up being called to testify by the way, at great risk to her life, because these boys were not fooling around. There was a lot of money in rum running, but she would testify and help get convictions of some of these rum runners. So between the two of them, they were this cryptographic powerhouse.
So I mean, and again, like, so look at the series of events. It just blows my mind because okay, you're helping break what was essentially the German submarine blockade, right? Like, because truly the thing that was frightening us the most is that submarine technology had developed as well as it had, and now they're communicating with these subs under the ocean secretly. And we have no idea. Sonar is still very, very young, and we're trying to beat that technology. And this couple helps. I don't know how many lives they saved by breaking the whole submarine communications codes. Right. Then you've got Prohibition, and they're like cracking the rum runners, the mob. I'm surprised they didn't get executed by the mob at some point.
Well, again, Elizabeth's life was genuinely in danger by her appearing at that trial.
Then you've got World War II and the Japanese codes, and they're breaking those codes, and God only knows how many lives they saved with that. I mean, too bad that they didn't get the details and the messages to the right people to stop Pearl Harbor from happening. And some would argue that's another whole conspiracy theory, right?
Well, in the 30s, as some people in the State Department were getting concerned about what Japan was doing, as well as what Germany was doing, they began to look at the German Enigma code and the Japanese, what we were calling their Purple code, and Elizabeth and William focusing their attention on Purple. By the way, the intense amount of work. There's no computers. There's slide rules and there's paper and pencil. And William suffered a nervous breakdown in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor. He recovered. They did complete their work decoding, figuring out Purple. That, the messages that our State Department and eventually Franklin Roosevelt would see that the Japanese were sending, there was no smoking gun, if I may, that told them we're going to attack on December 7th, 1941. There was none of that. It was all, stuff like, on this date, be sure to burn all your papers. There were inferences, circumstantial evidence, but nothing that said this thing was going to happen on that day. But
by the time the Battle of Midway happens, though, we have those. They don't know that we have their codes, and that's how we crushed them, right?
Yes, and it's the same. If anyone has seen the terrific movie, The Imitation Game, once you've decoded the enemy's codes, you can't just automatically, immediately go against the feint or the battle that you know they're going to have, because then you'll expose the fact that you know all their codes, and then they'll end up just changing their codes, which, by the way, the Germans did anyway. Their particular Enigma machine I think it had 5 of these wheels. In fact, I'm looking at one right now from my father's collection, and they added which again was like how many billions, 1 out of billions of chances to pick the right code. Then they added 2 more wheels, which further increased the complexity of the Enigma machine. So yeah, there was that combination of the ability to decode, decrypt those messages, but also knowing when to actually act on the information that they had. So they continued their work throughout the war. After the war, then we had the Cold War, and then there was a need for sending and receiving encrypted messages. And William Friedman would end up working for the government for the rest of his life. In fact, there is, and this is kind of the irony of it. And I'm going to have to. Unfortunately, I don't have a note in front of me. I don't know if it's the NSA building or the CIA headquarters, but there is a plaque to William Friedman, which my father really wanted to see. He wanted to go there and take a picture of it, and he didn't have the clearance. He was not allowed in the building, basically. But he knows it's there. It's documented as being there in one of their buildings.
I think it's the NSA.
Is it the NSA? Yes.
I think so.
So, and then now the final bit, again, Mr. Sarandis, if you're listening, here's the end of the 8th episode of the Netflix series on these people. Near the end of their lives, William and Elizabeth write a book, and the book is titled The Shakespearean Ciphers Examined. And in the book, while they express their admiration, their affection for Elizabeth Wells Gallup and George Fabian and Kate Prescott, they also demolish the notion that there was a biliteral cipher hidden in the first folio. In fact, they point out that one could use that biliteral cipher to prove that Shakespeare actually was the author of all of the canon, and so it was one of the last things that they ever published, and it kind of puts a nice coda, I think, on the story.
I think it's incredible when you look back at this entire tale that none of this would have happened. None of it would have happened without the work of Elizabeth Wells Gallup and without her literal, I would call it an obsession with trying to find bacon in the pages of the folio. And I can't imagine how many hours and hours William and Elizabeth spent together poring over every page of the folio in order to conduct this work under the direction of Gallup and her sister, Kate Wells, right? Without Shakespeare, the whole history of the world might have changed.
Well, yeah, but remember, certainly Elizabeth and Kate were great vocal proponents of Bacon having written the canon. But it was George Fabian who funded their research. It was George Fabian who allowed Elizabeth to allow Ms. Gallup to hire Elizabeth Smith and to hire William Friedman. So, Kate and Elizabeth Gallup were among many. Remember, they had a magazine, they had a society dedicated to Francis Bacon. So not taking away anything from Elizabeth and Kate, but you got to give this eccentric millionaire of George Fabian, I think, a lion's share of the credit, and that that I mean, it's so deliciously fun. The idea that he and his friend William Selig would conspire to have this trial simply to promote each other's works. That's the sort of stuff that comes from, I think, it's that wonderful piece of unique history, the characters that we meet through history.
These kinds of ideas are the types that, you can imagine too much brandy and cigars. And they're sitting around and they go, we ought to do, George. Well, I think that's a good idea, Colonel. Okay, Colonel.
Yeah.
To the Colonel's Club. Let's do it. That's incredible. But one of the things, just to circle back a bit, one of the things that is that I'm so curious about, and you talked about trying to find a transcript of the trial, and I, on the one hand, I'm surprised that it's not traceable. On the other hand, I'm not surprised because of the level of suppression that we see when it comes to, the sacrilege of claiming anyone besides the Stratford man was the author of the works of Shakespeare.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think it's about that. I think it is more about the embarrassment that the other judges in the Chicago court system felt over having them being ridiculed internationally for this decision. And I say this with all due respect to any of your listeners who believe and have evidence for the authorship being someone other than Shakespeare. But this was a very small percentage of the population back then. And so most people, they knew that Shakespeare wrote the works, and this decision just seemed so silly, as I think that's really what was the driving force behind the rescinding of the judge's decision, which is not an easy thing to do, by the way. Any of your lawyers in the audience know it's, for a judge's decision to be voided, that doesn't happen very often.
Well, yeah, so I said Judge Tuthill must have been livid over his colleagues of the bench, coming together. I mean, it's not even like it went to an appellate court, because Selig, who is the plaintiff and lost in the case, doesn't appeal the ruling. This was literally a decision made by other members of the bench to overturn a decision rendered by one of their own. On what grounds? Just on embarrassment? I mean, that's ridiculous. That is so counter to the U.S. justice system that I can't think about another scenario that would equate to that.
Well, if the other, and again, I'm not a lawyer. If you saw my LSAT scores, you'd know why. But the other judges, if they looked at the rationale for Tuthill's decision, they may have simply voided it on procedural grounds or logical grounds. Again, we don't have that paperwork either. And let me say, if after this podcast, some of your listeners who may be judges or lawyers who have some way to dive into a part of the Chicago archives that my father was unable to get to, if anyone can find that transcript, boy, I sure hope they would reach out to me through my website, davidkruh.com.
I would love, that's what I'm saying, is I would love to see the evidence that was presented. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get into the mind of Judge Tuthill, who, for whatever reason, decided to find in favor of Bacon as the author. And I'm wondering if what he really found was that the evidence for the Stratford man was so thin that he had no choice but to find in favor of Bacon, because the evidence for Bacon was twice as strong as the evidence from this country bumpkin from nowhere, right?
Oh my. Well, but again, since we don't have the transcript, we don't know how many hours or how many days were spent on the idea, was this Glover's son, did he have enough education? How did he know about about the law or about diplomacy? How much was spent on that, and how much was on the minutiae of italic, not italic, Baconian biliteral cipher? We don't know, and that was very frustrating, I know, to my father, and to me as well.
I also think it's interesting, and I know my listeners will agree, that this court case comes about because, and even if it was a planned publicity stunt, nonetheless, Selig's initial argument against Gallup's findings and against her publishing her book with her findings is purely financial. It is all about money. He says if her book is published, it's going to hurt my ability to make money off of the Shakespeare brand. And that is so consistent with the history of this topic. There are so many people who are so invested in the Shakespeare brand, and it generates so much revenue for them that they can't open their minds to even consider an examination of somebody else as the potential author, because they are absolutely tainted by cash. And I think that's ironic here in this court case, because it really was about financial, right? It was all it was a lawsuit. It was a civil lawsuit about money.
Yeah, but let me ask you, as somebody, you're much more deeply embedded in the notion of how people are wedded to Shakespeare, but from a purely artistic point of view, are the works and the poems and the sonnets are they any less beautiful or any less indicative of the human condition? If it turns out not to be Shakespeare, they're still terrific pieces of literature and wonderful drama. And I understand, that name Shakespeare may necessarily somehow fall into disrepute, but yet the works themselves, do they not stand on their own? What do you think?
The answer to that question is of course they stand on their own. But I would argue that the meter, as it were, on appreciation of the beauty and the magnitude of knowledge and the capturing of, as you say, the human condition. I would say that that meter doesn't move south if it's not the Stratford man, but it absolutely moves north if it's someone else, because we can now tie life events and history to the creation of the works in a way we've never been able to do with the Stratford man. So when we look you mentioned Poe, and I love that, and we're going to talk about your play in just a moment, but and I love that you included that in the play. But you mentioned Poe, and I use Poe as a great example of how important it is to know the author, because we can read Poe's works and we can find them macabre, we can find them even beautiful, we can find them intriguing, suspenseful, horrific even at times. But as soon as we know the life story of that author, we understand those works, I say, 1,000-fold better, because of the amount of immense suffering he went through in his life, the amount of loss, the tragic deaths that he had to endure of his loved ones all around him through his life. His own addiction to morphine, for instance, which could bring about a lot of weird visions that ended up in some of his writings. I think that depth of detail makes us understand the autobiographical nature of the work. And I would argue it's the autobiographical nature of Shakespeare that we're missing, that we need to find.
But see, it's interesting you mentioned Poe, because I don't feel like I need that backstory of Poe's to appreciate The Raven or The Gold Bug or any of his works. It maybe layers it a bit. In fact, getting back to the Stratfordian man, to me, the one of the the miracle of those works. And again, I'm approaching my 7th decade, and I grew up, not hearing very much about this controversy, but what I heard was that this simple man from the countryside could create these works. That particular miracle. It's the same thing with Michelangelo, or how a patent clerk in Switzerland could come up with with his theories. To me, that's part of the appeal of those great works, that they could have sprung almost seemingly out of nowhere and inspire any of us to, despite whatever beginnings, middles, or ends that we may be having in our own lives, to continue to try to strive and create things.
Yeah, but we know at least 10 times more about Michelangelo, and we know how he learned to create art and who he learned from. We know, you mentioned the patent clerk from Switzerland, we know who Einstein's teachers and mentors were, how they recognized his brilliance and then helped shape that brilliance into the scientist he became. With the Stratford man, we have zero evidence of any mentors, any teachers, any influences on his life who helped shape or mold the quote-unquote genius of the miracle man from Stratford. We don't have any of that. That's the difference.
Yeah. Well, by the way, in terms of Einstein, up until his 1905 paper on waves on light, he didn't really get a lot of encouragement. I would suggest, that a lot of that did have to come from internally, from doing a lot of reading.
He ended up living in the home of some family friends who also were boarding a renowned mathematician. That's where he got influenced and where he was first sort of mentored and taken under the wing and trained, because this educator said, this boy is brilliant, gave him his first books on mathematics and on the laws of physics. So there is a mentor relationship there that was super important.
Your point is well taken, but I would state that, and again, I have an engineering degree, but I did know better than C+ and B- in my calc courses. You can put a paintbrush in my hand, and only if I'm painting a study can I be effective as a paint. Now, sure, you can give someone a book, train somebody, or tell them, A squared plus B squared equals C, but it doesn't make them mathematicians or artists or great creators of art. There's that spark, and maybe I'm a romantic, and I imagine that this glow, that spark of creativity. And to me, again, being that romantic, I'm much more enamored of the idea that it was somebody who he listened, he read. Agreed. There is no direct evidence of him being mentored, but are we stating could he read?
We don't know. We don't know the answer to that.
We don't know the answer to that. Okay.
We have six signatures that
I know
are
the
supposedly
6 scroll
his
signatures, none of which were on a play.
Yeah,
he
they're
did
all
go to
wrong.
school.
None of them match. Only 2 out of the 6 actually match each other.
Yeah, I've seen them. He's got worse handwriting than I do. That's how I feel about Shake. God bless. He had worse handwriting than me.
If it's even his handwriting, and most likely what it is law clerks who were writing down the name, and the reason that they're all misspelled is because he didn't know how to spell his name, so the law clerk just spelled it the way he thought it sounded it out phonetically and wrote it down. That's most likely the truth there. But, you know,
Okay.
even let's look at our own story here that we're talking about here. So without, you've even said here in this episode, without George Fabian, where does Gallup's research go? Where does Friedman end up? So even there you have, even though George Fabian isn't the genius mentor, he's the benefactor mentor who provides all the funding and the place where they can do their work, the laboratories, the equipment, you know, the living expenses. So even here we have a situation where some outside influence saw the genius and fostered it. I think that's important.
And I accept that. That's a great point. I acknowledge that it's a great point. I would also.
I know it breaks your heart, right?
Well, no, it doesn't break my heart. I mean, as I say, I come to this subject not only as the son of a man who really introduced me to this story, but I come to it as a marketer who's fascinated by that whole conspiracy between Selig and Fabian, and I come to it as an American who's who has to acknowledge that, again, as you just stated, without Fabian, without him bringing all these people together at Riverbank, would we have broken Purple? Would we have made as many inroads as we did?
Or would
during
we
the
all be
Cold
speaking
War?
German or Japanese today instead?
Or
right?
Russian? Sure,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And we have we have to acknowledge how lucky we are that all these things did happen the way they did.
And I say the works of Shakespeare are to blame. There you go. How about that? But yes,
By the way,
you are a
the
hopeless
first-
romantic because I read your play, which it's delightful, by the way. And as a
thank
longtime
you.
theater producer and director and actor, I found myself very early, within the first 7-8 pages, saying, I'd like to produce this play. It has some production hurdles that would make it difficult to produce. For instance, finding a stuffed moose head is not always the easiest thing to and you use a unit set for the most part, and some of the clever stage direction helps explain how to transport from one location to another, which I think is very clever and well done. But
Thank you.
you really are telling a love story in this play. You surround it by
Yes.
the details of the events that are occurring and the characters, as you put it, and some of the characters are, and you capture them quite well. In your writing, but obviously the central theme of it is the love affair that develops between William and Elizabeth. So yeah, you definitely have that.
Oh, thank you. And
romantic
by the way,
edge to you.
I'll state this publicly, and you can play it back if I ever say I didn't say it. But if you want to produce this piece, there's no royalty. You may have it, sir.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I would, that would tickle me to death to have it being produced. We had a stage reading here in Boston on Beacon Hill of all places. But that would be, first of all, thank you. And yes, that was really the core of it. I always felt. As somebody who also married outside his faith, that love story emits, especially in that era, that time frame, is so compelling.
Well, and again, you have some witty banter. It's humorous at times. It's touching at times. It's intriguing because of the whole Bacon thing and Shakespeare and the trial coming.
Well,
and then the way you wrap it up at the end, I think, is quite nice too. In fact, I found myself in the last final pages going, "How is he going to end this now? What's the tag going to be?"
Yeah.
Well done, sir. I appreciate
Well, thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
And coming from someone I know that you produce a great number of pieces, I'm very flattered. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I know that actors in my company, I'm going to share it with them so that they can read it because I know that they'll enjoy it as well.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, but I did go, the moose head is a problem. the Chicago Library copy of the first folio is a problem.
Yes.
Like there are
Yes, it is.
certain production hurdles. When you've done it as long as I have and you're reading a play, you immediately start going, okay, well, that's an issue. I don't know if I have the money for that. I don't know if I can create that.
Well, it's funny that you say that. I wrote that piece, and it was before I had written a musical which got produced at an equity stage here in Boston about the curse of the Bambino, the Boston Red Sox, and their failures in all those World Series from 1918 all the way up until 2004. So when I tell you I was a total neophyte, just finding a way to tell this story, either magazine articles, newspaper columns, and then this play. The story is so fascinating, and all the ways that things had to fall into place for this to happen. So that's why I said, well, let me try writing a play about it. If I were to go back and read the piece now, I would probably be so embarrassed, because I learned so much working with an award-winning director and producer at the Lyric Stage here in Boston when the musical was being going through its process. I'm sure I would approach things very differently today.
Well, I think it's a clever piece, and I enjoyed it, and I want to let the listeners know that, and you're gracious enough to have it in its full length right there on your website, free for anybody to read. So they can just go to davidkruh.com and find your page about the trial, and they can read your article that I came upon, which is how I found you, was your article in History Magazine. And then, of course, I started looking for, the newspaper accounts, and there are a couple of them that still can be found in like newspaper archive sites online.
Yes. Yes.
New York Times is one that's still there and available. And then there's one also from the Chicago Tribune, of course, because it all happened in Chicago.
So and let me say, if there's anybody who's interested in, I also have a illustrated PowerPoint slide talk all about the story of the trial. I go into the whole notion of where the idea that Shakespeare was not the author came from. And if anyone is interested in a Zoom presentation, please visit David Kruh, KRUH.com, and I'd be happy to chat with you.
And I can tell you all of you out there, Quiller Nation, David is very easy to reach through his website. That's how I found him. And he was very responsive right away to my inquiry about becoming a guest. And as you can tell, he's a delightful guy. And so if you have, whether it's your book club, your library group, whoever out there, I know several of you have your own groups where you do studies of the plays, or you have discussions about authorship together. David is making the gracious offer to make himself available to you, so reach out to him through his site. It's davidkruh.com. Kruh is how you spell his last name. You might also find yourself sort of bouncing around his site and looking at some of the other work that he has done and some of the other books that he has written. David, what made you create a presentation, though, on this?
It's something that I have done with many of the projects that I have worked on. My first published work was a book on a place here in Boston that used to be the entertainment district, where we had burlesque houses and nightclubs and tassel twirlers, and it's where all the soldiers and the sailors went. It was a place called Scollay Square, Scollay, Scollay Square. And when the book came out, somebody said to me, you're not going to make a lot of money from the book. And by the way, they were right. Royalties are just awful. But they said, you'll make your money giving talks. So I put together a slide presentation, and I just started doing that with my Bambino speech with on the Red Sox. I've written a couple of pieces on the Ponzi scheme, and a couple of there's a highway that with another author we wrote a book about this highway that encircles the Boston metropolitan area. So it just became this habit where, okay, now I've written this thing. Now if I really want to make any money from it, I will create a nice presentation, and I would go to libraries, historical societies, and then this wonderful thing called Zoom came along, and now I can give these talks to people not just here around the country or in Massachusetts, but around the country and around the world. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's great. That's fantastic, and I love the fact that the history of your interest in this. Sort of being inherited, as it were. It's sort of it's in your DNA now, the whole cryptology aspect of it. But I also love that you brought this attention to these great American heroes. William Friedman and Elizabeth Smith Friedman are truly great American heroes. And when you look at the difference in their lives, her, as you said, 16th generation Quaker from Pennsylvania, and he, a Russian Jewish immigrant, the fact that they would find each other and how they found each other, and then the great romance and marriage that they had together up until death. He died in 1969. They were married in 1917. Mm-hmm.
It's a truly great love story. Yes, absolutely. That's another one of the things that drew me to the story.
I mean, they were married more than 50 years, almost 60 years together. That's incredible. As
any married person will know, not only were they married, but they worked together.
Right, side by side. On everything, right? And so that in itself is, you talk about two souls who truly found each other. And again, back to George Fabian, without him, it would have never happened. Without Gallup, it would have never happened. Without Shakespeare and Bacon, it would have never happened. And I can't think of the probably hundreds of thousands of lives that were saved through their work. And it's one of the reasons why they deserve to be commemorated. It's one of the reasons why they're buried at Arlington Cemetery, where they deserve to be. Just a tremendous story. And thank you so much for sharing.
Well, thank you. And you mentioned his internment at Arlington, and what is on their tombstone, which they shared together, is the phrase "knowledge is power," and anyone who knows Francis Bacon knows that it was he who created that, who first made that statement.
Now, I would be more impressed if it were in bilateral code, and so viewers would have to decipher it in order to read it.
Well. If you come to Boston and the Mount Auburn Cemetery and look for the gravesite of George Fabian, you will see on his tombstone a coded message.
Oh, love it.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know what we have to do. This definitely needs to be a Netflix series. There's just so many.
Here.
There's so
just
many great characters
me now,
here.
Ted.
The richness of the characters, the details of the story. You can't make this up. You literally couldn't create a better story. And here it is, all in the historical record, right there.
And that is. It's the same thing I say about the Ponzi scheme story and several other stories that including the topic of a book that is going to be published in April, a nonfiction mystery, real-life mystery that, with the help of a genealogist, I was able to solve. It's a story of a baby who was abandoned on the Boston Common on VJ Day, August 15th, 1945. What happened to him? how he found his mother and what his mother ended up doing that absolutely shocked everybody. Again, you just said the statement, you can't make this up. And those are the stories that I love finding.
Well, that's fantastic. He is David Kruh, historian and writer. You can find him at davidkruh.com. Thank you, David, so much for sharing all of this with us and your time as well.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Well, there you have it, Quiller Nation, the inside story on the trial of the century, the earliest 20th century, that is. That trial that declared William Shakespeare of Stratford innocent of having written the works of Shakespeare. You know, Francis Bacon was a graduate of Gray's Inn, a fellow innsman, as they are called, to Edward de Vere. And Gray's Inn presents a variable rogues gallery of historical figures who all play a prominent part in the Shakespeare authorship mystery. Names like William Cecil, Robert Cecil, Francis Walsingham, Henry Roseley, and several others were all also members of Gray's Inn. Perhaps Gray's Inn could provide the secret key and clue we have always needed to unravel this mystery, which is why we selected Gray's Inn and the Great Hall there to be the site of our coming Shakespeare and the Law Symposium in London on May 9th. What an incredible event it is going to be. We have already lined up a talented list of presenters and performers who will present what we believe to be irrefutable evidence that the author of Shakespeare was not only a lawyer, but a member of Gray's Inn. From presentations of scenes from as many as 6 different plays, some analysis of the sonnets, all bookended by explanations of the deep legal knowledge and ramifications to the law of the time that you can find in those scenes and in that poetry, to discussion of the legal importance the works of Shakespeare have played in the development of the law and legal concepts over the past 4 centuries in all of Western civilization. This full day of immersion into the canon will include pieces from Hamlet, Measure for Measure, Henry VI, Part 1, The Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, and The Comedy of Errors, which, by the way, was performed in that very same room in December 1594. This performance was part of what famously became known as the Night of Errors during the Christmas revels of that season of 1594, which actually led to another famous court proceeding, and I use that term lightly here and in air quotes, when the members of Gray's Inn and their guests from the Middle Temple all put the producer of the evening's entertainments on trial under the authority of the Prince of Purpool, who was a sort of king of misrule that they had crowned, who reigned over the festivities and the proceedings of those several days. Now, we know that for a fact that Francis Bacon was a part of these proceedings and most likely helped to pen the speeches presented by the Prince of Purpool and his selected cabinet members. I think they called them counselors of each type of area, such as, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Culture. Those types of titles were given to several members of the inn who served the Prince of Purpool. And he delivered a speech. They all delivered speeches back to him. And it was, a great pageantry and presentation. Bacon and the sorcerer is how they referred to this unknown anonymous producer of entertainments, including he who presented the Comedy of Errors with a group of actors, his acting company. They put this sorcerer on trial. because the evening grew out of control after the performance of the play. And Bacon and the sorcerer, whomever he was, were also instrumental in forming what was known then for that several days as the Garter of the Helmet, which of course was, sort of a farcical, satirical version of knighthood. And it became a new name for what were once called in the previous couple of decades, Minerva's Men. Now, if you look back in the library, you'll find we have a wonderful episode about Minerva's Men and the early writers of English literature, stemming back to the late 1550s throughout the 1560s, which sort of served as the foundation for what would become a new renaissance, a new age of writing in the 1590s, which is when all of this is happening. Well, why were they called Minerva's Men? Well, they were named after who? Pallas Athena. Why is it called the Garter of the Helmet? Well, because, as we know, Athena was sprung from her father's brain, fully armored, most notably wearing her helmet. So you're going to learn about all of these fabulous details and more by attending our event May 9th at the Great Hall at Gray's Inn in London, England. You will witness a recreation of some portions of the Night of Errors and resulting proceedings, just as it was presented in December of 1594 in that very same room. You can also join the actors and presenters the evening before, Friday, May 8th, at the Ship Tavern in Holborn, which we have already secured our reservation, so they'll be expecting a group of us. Friday, May 8th at the Ship Tavern in Holborn is where we will have our pre-event social gathering the night before. It's very near to Gray's Inn. It's a beautiful, old-fashioned tavern. Everything you would expect from a tavern in London, with all the beautiful woodworking and gorgeous bar, historical location. So we'll be there on Friday, May 8th, and then all day Saturday, May 9th, in the Great Hall at Gray's Inn. It's going to be such an exciting event. Visit monumentalshakespeare.com, monumentalshakespeare.com, to learn all of the fabulous details and register for the event today. Now, this is important. Seating is limited. We won't be bringing in layers of scaffolding to create tiers of seats the way they did in 1594, which became part of the problem, by the way. They packed that hall so full of people, and by the written reports, and there are written historical reports of this event, it got so hot, and I can't imagine how hot and stuffy and sweaty, and everybody was drinking wine and ale and who knows what else. It had to have just been nasty in that room on that evening, and no wonder then you also introduce a group of actors into the fray. All of these young students of the inn, all these older graduates who are, carrying on these festivities, this bawdry event of hilarity. It degraded, which is why it became known as the Night of Errors. But we won't be doing that. We won't be bringing in scaffolding. We won't be setting extra tiers of seats, so there will be only floor seating, and the hall can only hold so many people that way. So you must get your seat reserved today. Registrations are already rolling in. We had sort of our soft launch. We sent it out to those of you on our email subscriber list, and we've mentioned it in our social media. We'll be doing a more full force publicity effort starting right now as you hear this episode. And of course, our goal is to draw in current innsmen from all 4 of the Inns of Court in England, and we have some sources there to help us spread the word to them, because we want you there, fellow Quillers, but we also want people who are new to this mystery. And our goal with all of this is to present evidence to those who are learned in the law that they cannot refuse to acknowledge, and with the hope that they will acknowledge that whomever wrote these works of Shakespeare had to be one of them. And our hope is that the more lawyers, barristers, and solicitors out there who claim the writer known as William Shakespeare as one of their own, the more obvious it becomes that it could never have been some country bumpkin from Stratford. He would not have even been allowed in the room unless perchance he was one of those actors who performed in the Comedy of Errors on that evening. Otherwise, he would not have ever been allowed in the room. He certainly would not have been the producer of the evening's entertainment. He would not have been writing verses and speeches for members of the Inns of Court to present in satire of the English crown and English aristocracy. He certainly would not have been placed on trial by these men, this low commoner who was, if you believe, writing plays. So that's our goal here, and that's our point. So we are hoping to draw in all of those audience members, which means that the seating will indeed be limited, and you have a chance to get to this event and get your registration in before the flood of the public. So monumentalshakespeare.com, monumentalshakespeare.com, and be prepared to join us for the most entertaining and educational Shakespeare authorship event of the year, surrounded by the centuries of history that you will undoubtedly feel when you step into the Great Hall at Gray's Inn. And now, before we sign off, fellow Quillers, it's that time again when we call upon producer Jake to help us announce this month's Quiller of the Month. Jake, how are you?
I am well, Stephen. Thank you so much for asking. I would ask you in return how you are, but you can't answer because we record this little bit completely independent from one another. So anyways, it is that time for me to pick our 2026 February Quiller of the Month. If you're not sure what this is, we got to head on over to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger and find out. All eligible quillers are entered into our monthly giveaway here, and I have our Wheel o' Names loaded up right now with those specific individuals. So without further ado, it is a spinning, and our Quiller of the Month for February 2026 is Quizzi. 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 Quizzi is simply known as Quizzi on the Patreon. Thank you so much, Quizzi, for your continued support of the program. Thanks to everybody who continues to support us over on the Patreon. We would not, could not, should not do the program without you. And we do hope that you'll continue to support us in all the months and years to come. Congrats to Quizzi. And back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jake. And thank you to all of you who continue to support our efforts to bring the details of this great mystery to the masses. For those of you who believe and support our mission, for those of you who have jumped on board to assist with the planning of this event, boots on the ground in London to help promote the event, we're so grateful to all of you for believing in the mission, joining us in this mission to give reason for the learned men and women of the law to accept Shakespeare as one of their own. There are more great episodes coming your way between now and May, but can't wait to see all of you in London in May. Get your registration now, monumentalshakespeare.com. Until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.